always be around, but it just wasn't true. But you get back to Eisner. I mean, you can't overemphasize the importance of the spirit and the impact that had once it started being the Harvey reprints were big, but when Warren started and the kitchen sink took over, they started reprinting that stuff. A whole generation discovered that guy. A whole generation began to go, "Are you kidding me? This is this guy," and he had people that helped him. He had Grand and Eddie worked on it. A lot of different people worked on it. There's a guy named Abe Clangston.
Yeah,
maybe the wrong pronunciation.
Kangason.
But he was the guy who was the letterer, who was very instrumental in making it good. And then and then the great Jules Pfeiffer, wrote a lot of that stuff, with Eisner in the late 40s through the 50s. And you can't do better than the guys win the Pulitzer. I mean, Jesus, I met Pfeiffer once, and he was a sweetheart. He was a great guy. But just think about the talent was involved, in doing that material. And of course, he had to have some assistance after a while, because imagine having to do a spirit story, 8 pages every single week.
It had to be grueling.
It's incredible, and he did it.
Can't imagine.
And he did it.
And plus, in the early, he was overseeing all the production and the other stuff.
He has to make sure everything else is done, and the guy was I mean, like I was saying earlier, every generation, everything. There's a couple of guys that just this the cream rising to the top kind of thing, where you go, my God, these were so good, and I don't think anybody will ever touch them. I mean, there's some really talented people out there in the comic book business right now. I mean, Mike Mignola and Arthur Adams, Bruce Timm, that guy Rizzo who does Moonshine. Kevin Nolan. There's some really, really super talented people still in this business now. But I mean, why was Wally Wood so good? Because Wally Wood had to turn out so many pages over, for the deadlines that he had to meet, that he would do these 5, 6, 7 page stories for EC, and he had the time to do it, but he would still do 100 other things beside that. They had to turn out so many pages that they got good because they had the drive, and they wanted to be. This is another theory of mine. The Golden Age artists are the guys that grew up and there weren't comic books. So they kind of laid the foundation for everything. Fine, Eisner, Kirby, Jack Cole, Mort Meskin. I mean, guys that are, Basil Wolverton, incredible, talented people.
There's nothing to look back at. They got to figure it out.
They had to figure it out. And,
right.
And
Pioneers.
Siegel and Schuster doing Superman. Of course, if you look at it really close, you go, well, he's just looking at Roy Crane, But anyway, but that's okay too. That's okay too, because, if you're going to, as they've said before, if you're going to steal from the best. They're the best. But anyway, the first generation was those guys. And then the first generation that grew up wanted to do comic books were that generation of Kurtzman and Wood and Davis and Ingalls and Ditko and all those guys. And that generation, I mean, they had to produce a lot of material, because if they didn't, they weren't going to be able to feed their families. And they had a drive and a dedication to it. That's just it's next to none. Kids, I mean, people nowadays don't do that many pages before, they just don't. They don't. There's not as many outlets for that kind of stuff. But then you think about all the work that they did, made them good. But it also was because their goal was to be as good as they could be in doing their work. I mean, I asked Williamson about it. I said, Al, was there a competitive thing going on at DC Comics? I mean, and he goes, no, John, there was no competition whatsoever. He said, but I can tell you one thing. If I brought a story in that I was doing for EC and Kurtzman was there, or Johnny Craig was there, or George Evans was there, and they were turning in their artwork, he said, by God, I didn't want my story to be the one that stinks. I wanted my story to be good. He said, and so we were pushed. It was not a competition, but it was a thing where
pride in your work.
Pride, and they wanted to do the best they could. And they worked, and they wanted to do the best they could because they were doing what they wanted to do. They're doing mature stuff. They were doing stuff that they wanted to do, and it brought out the best in them. And then that next generation after that are guys like Neil Adams and Steranko Wrightson and Kaluta and Jeff Jones and Barry Smith and those guys. Which there's nothing wrong with those guys either. They were great. They were fantastic. But I think as the generations roll along, and this is just my opinion, I think they get a little farther and farther away because then the next generation is like Byrne, Perez, and Miller. Then the one after that is the Image guys and those guys. And I don't think they're in the same class. But then again, I'm a crusty old guy. I don't care what anybody thinks about me. I'm just telling you my opinion. If I'm wrong, that's okay. But I'm just telling you what I think.
Seth can tell you I'm the crusty guy in the DC Comics.
That's why you wanted me here. You wanted me here so you say, well,
better.
You may be bad, but you ain't that bad. So I understand.
You make him look good. That's why he wanted it. Seriously, next to John, I look like a prince.
He looks great, but still, I got hair. So I'm rolling. I still got a little hair.
Well, that's the other thing.
Eisner didn't have hair.
When I first met Will Eisner in '84, he was over 6 foot tall. He was a very tall man, very, quite an appearance. But as he got older, he shrunk. But when you first met him, when I'm back then, you're like, man, I can see why, because he was quite a strong, tall guy.
Sounds imposing.
I carried his bag. I was like, can I carry your bag?
Yeah.
Sure, I'll be glad to.
I'm thinking about. So 2 things cross my mind as I'm listening to you. Is one, the thing that always caught my attention about the whole conversation when I would talk with Jack, because he was really, adamant about the fact, like, I did it first. And I'm like, yeah, but one of the things, and you can argue over who got there first, but there's also who defines it, and I really feel like when Contract with Guy came out, it sort of set the standard, when what's his name came out with Standard Oil, that was the whole concept behind Standard Oil. This is the standard. Everybody else who doesn't have this, why are you getting it? You know what I mean? This should be the sort of gold standard idea. And with the Eisner approach, what you saw was somebody who said, sure, here's a medium and here's an approach to comics that is different, but there's also about what you're doing with it. Like how much excellence are you trying to find in it? Or how much of it are you trying to explore and discover? Well, he'd already done that with comic strips, and now he was doing it with the graphic novel.
Well, you think about, for example, The Spirit. One of the big reasons why Eisner wanted to do that, besides, I'm sure, owning the copyright was important, but he knew he was writing to an older audience because it was going in people's houses that not just kids were going to read it, but adults would read it. So he started doing a much more mature themes. That's why The Spirit now, when you read it, sure, there's stuff that's funny and sadly, the Ebony character is, over the top racist. But its time period, it wasn't looked that way. But, he knew he was writing to an older audience, so he wrote up to them instead of writing down to them. And that's why EC comics were so important, because they, Kurtzman and Gaines and Feldstein were all in the military. They saw these kids in World War II reading comics, because most of them didn't even get through high school. That's probably the best they could ever read is that. So they said, instead of writing down to these people, we're going to write up to them. And they did. And the stuff sold like crazy, so, and of course, MAD became an American institution. But, I still marvel at the fact that guys like Eisner and Kirby, there's so many of them, these brilliant guys, they always made the effort to go to shows and meet the public and celebrate comics and meet their fans. They didn't have to. They didn't, but they did. They made the effort. They would go and they would sit there. And, it's incredible the dedication that Eisner had to do that, because he would go to Canada. When that time he called me, he's either going to Australia, New Zealand, or something. He would go everywhere to promote and celebrate comics. It was a wonderful thing. And he once told me I need to change the name of my store and take comic books off of it and call it Pop Culture Store, because that's what comic books are, as an example of pop culture. And I'm like, well, okay, but no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that.
Now, John, I was wondering if you could help me out, because up until this point, I have simply not made any attempt to really explain to anybody who it is that I'm talking to. Now, somebody who heard my conversation that I dropped the first part of it the podcast today, they know who Matt is because one, he's been hosting the Classic Comics on Comics in Motion, or they heard him talking with me, or they've heard him on Tony's show. But I didn't give you any sort of introduction. Folks who have been listening up to this point are like, who is this guy? Like, how is it he's just walking up to? Because the first couple of things that caught my attention as I was listening from the very beginning was how is it that you were able to get these conventions going? Did you already have a shop then? When did owning a shop and the connection to the conventions and these artists, did one lead to the other, or did they all start to come together as bits? And who is it that everyone's listening to? Because you're coming to us from a very interesting locale as well. It's not like I've just caught you at your home or in your comic shop.
You're at my store. Well, that's kind of a long conversation, but it started when Alex wanted to come to Greensboro. It didn't work out, and we started having shows once a year, and the shows that I threw with Acme Comics were really, it's kind of okay. Get this: 1983, Archie Goodwin, Murphy Anderson. 1984, Will Eisner. Now I'm not going to name all the people that were there, but Will Eisner. 1985 was Jack Kirby. 1986 was Alex Toth. In 1987, the guest of honor was Al Williamson. Now, you'd have to go to New York or San Diego to see those guys. But I'll tell you a story, and it's true. When we got Jack Kirby to come, we used to send, whenever we do a convention, we used to write it up and send a couple of photographs to the Comics Buyer's Guide. Y'all remember the Comics Buyer's Guide?
I do.
It was the lifeblood of comic collectors, That's where you got your news. It's before computers. Right. And so we send these little pictures in. Well, once we had the picture, and this picture of me looking at Jack Kirby, we did the panel together. You can find that on YouTube. Just put Jack Kirby, Greensboro, North Carolina, and you can see me 36 years ago interviewing Jack Kirby in little bits. There's only a little bit of it that exists. Well, anyway, I get this letter in the mail, and it's from Alex, and I open it up. And what was in it was that article that Alex had ripped out of the Comics Buyer's Guide, and then he wrote exclamation points and question marks, and he said, "You didn't tell me about this! What the hell? What's the deal?" And I went, and it was cool. It was like, I said, "Well, Alex, we tried to get you for the show, and, you said you couldn't make it, and blah, blah, blah." And he goes, "Well, who have you had?" I said, "Well, first one we had, Archie and Murphy, and the second one we had Will Eisner, and then, then we had," he goes, "You had Will Eisner?" I said, "Yeah, we had Will Eisner, and then we had Jack Kirby." And he goes, "You mean you had Will Eisner, then Jack Kirby?" I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Well, if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me. By God, I'll go." It was the ego. It was like he wanted to be a part of it. Now, I quit Acme Comics in 1989 and opened up my own store into July, 1st of August in 89. And I continued I decided to throw my own shows. And I had some great shows. I mean, the first show I had Al Williamson, George Evans, Angelo Torres, and Dave Stevens, along with George Pratt, Kent Williams, Mark Chiarello. Mark Chiarello was a gopher for Archie Goodwin at Epic. But Archie said, "You'll love the guy. He's great." Okay, we'll get him. And then the next show my comics were making so much money then. I flew in Brian Bolland from England on me.
To Greensboro, North Carolina.
To Greensboro. We had Bolland and Wrightson, and Mike Mignola was there. And then the next show was Eisner. And on top of that, we had Archie was back, Al Williamson was back, Maurice Severin, and Joe Orlando. Those are off the top of the head. And then the next show, I decided to sell out, and I got Kevin Eastman, the Ninja Turtles, because I figured, well, maybe somebody will show up if we got the Ninja Turtles. We had big crowds. We had easily over 1,000 plus on all these shows, which in Greensboro, is maybe the second or third largest city in North Carolina. It's not like Podunk City or anything. So anyway, it was great. To give you a story about Kevin Eastman, Eastman came to the show, and he sat at his table the whole time and did free drawings of the Ninja Turtles to every single kid that walked up to that table. And he stayed there for hours. And we used to have these little receptions before the show. And Kevin Eastman walked up to me, and he said, "John, I need to ask you a question." I said, Sure, Kevin. What? He goes, "Is it okay if I smoke a cigarette?" And I was like, Oh, hell yeah, man. You're in North Carolina. We make them here. Shit, yeah. Go for it, man. You smoke. He goes, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't doing anything wrong. I said, no, it's cool, It's cool. And then his gopher at that time, this is back during the days of Tundra, was a guy named Paul Jenkins. And he's the guy who wrote, he's a big time writer now. He's an English guy who wrote the Wolverine Origin book, which was really good. And Paul Jenkins walks up to me. He goes, John, mate. I said, yeah, Paul. He goes, what did Kevin just ask you? And so I told him, and he goes, John, do you have any idea how much money Kevin Eastman made this year just on toys? And I went, I ain't got a clue. I don't have a clue. And he goes, John, this is not the comics. This is not the bubble gum. This is not the movies. Just in toy sales, his cut was $40 million. And he's asking you permission to light a cigarette. He said, I just don't get it. And I said, he's a good guy. He's a good guy. And I think at that show we had Dick Giordano came for the first time, and he was great. Wow. And then the last show of that run, that's when the death of Superman, and then after that everything fell apart. We had Jeff Jones, the painter, illustrator Jeff Jones, who was a great guy.